Okay, so in the first part, we talked a lot about the fact that it's our habits, not our goals. It's the actions that we take, not just our intentions, that lead us to greater success. We learned that personal habits power professional performance. So we need both a strong set of capacity driving actions as well as a strong set of production oriented actions. You've got to have both if you're going to deliver results. Then we found that most people quit. So next season of our study was, how do you get people to do hard things? And that is where we fortunately had one client who trained athletes and soldiers. He was a former professional baseball player down in Tallahassee, Florida. And he said some things that were kind of remarkable. He said, actually, I know you're right. First of all, that's how I train athletes. I get them doing a handful of things exceptionally well. It takes perfect practice, cited all the 10,000 hours things from Anders Ericsson and such. But he also said, I know that most people can't do it. And there's no way I could have done it either in baseball if it hadn't been for unbelievable accountability. So coach, position coach, general manager, the media, loved ones, teammates who would take my job if I wasn't willing to do the work. He said that the real thing, the real trick to success is not figuring out what to do. It's figuring out how to do it when you no longer feel like it. That sounds subtle, but that was really deep. Now, the only thing that we didn't hear was that it had anything to do with baseball. So that study continued. We talked to more professional baseball players, and then we went to football players, and then we thought, wow, these guys have the opportunity to make tens of millions of dollars. What about people who don't? As we actually started to look into other sports that didn't pay as well, eventually we got to athletes like Olympians who did not get paid, and then went to soldiers, fighter pilots, and special forces soldiers. We even started to say, how do people do hard things when there is no payoff? In fact, there's tremendous risk of death. It turns out they're all leveraging some of the same ideas. First of all, they spend almost all day, every day, practicing. The things that they do are rarely urgent. So if you're familiar with this Eisenhower decision matrix, made very popular by Stephen Covey, he said, when you talk about time management, typically you'll talk about these two dimensions. Is something important, and is it urgent? And if you want to be effective, you take care of the urgent, important things, and then you lean into some of the not urgent, important things, and you try to minimize or delegate or stop doing the things that are not important. Well, what we learned is that our soldiers and athletes friends, they were living in quadrant 2. They're spending almost all their time there, and that is the growth quadrant. In fact, almost all the things that make us better are rarely urgent. So if you can spend more time in the growth quadrant, take that from whatever percentage it is now and double it, add a few minutes, add 20 minutes to it each week, you're likely to get better. The problem with us is that we're bombarded with all these other electronic communications and things that look urgent, and many of them also look important. Our friends, our digital marketing friends, have gotten very good at getting our attention. And so quadrants 1, 3, and 4 are often dominating our schedules. How do you claw that back? Well, it's starting out as a question for you. I would ask you, where is your time going? If you were to map out which quadrants are getting the bulk of your time, I'm kind of curious, if it looked like a pie chart, how much time is going into quadrant 2? Now, I would suggest you pause this, take a second, and reflect on that. Maybe even scratch it out on a piece of paper, and then think about, what would it take to put a little bit more time into quadrant 2? Here's some other insights. The soldiers and athletes are not actually choosing to do quadrant 2. Someone else is choosing it for them. They typically rely on rituals, not themselves. So these guys right here in this photo, or there may be some ladies in there, they are not actually saying, you know what I want to do? I want to get down and do push-ups or do a plank. Nope. Somebody is saying, it's time. Get on the deck and do the first one, do the second one, hold it. That is actually profound insight. They're not trying to do it on their own. So what do we typically do? Well, we try to get motivated. We try to rely on our own habit, or maybe we try to our own willpower, or we try to build habits. Most of what we know about these things is myth. A lot of it is false. Let's talk about motivation. Dr. BJ Fogg at Stanford, he talks about motivation as being like a sound wave. It just goes up and down. All we know is if it's up, it's going to go down. The good news, if it's down, it's probably going to come back up, but it's pretty unpredictable. His key takeaway in his program called Tiny Habits is to recognize that sometimes you are highly motivated. Use a high motivation mountaintop experience to do something hard. Other times, you're not. It's unpredictable, except that you know it's going to happen. So in a way, it is totally predictable. You know you're going to have low motivation days. Set out to do easy things. Use your high motivation not to set your goals. Use your high motivation to make the process easier for your low motivation days. So if that looked like, hey, I want to eat better, when I'm highly motivated, that's when I do the shopping, that's when I do the cooking, that's when I do the packaging, that's when I throw out everything else. So the easiest thing to do on a low motivation day is to eat what my high motivation self set out for me. We've got to make habits easier by making the high motivation the time where we make it easier when we're low motivation. And just even knowing this can sort of change how you go about doing things. So if I need to make a bunch of sales calls, use my high motivation day to figure out who that's going to be, when I'm going to do it, get the time blocked on the calendar, make it easy. So when it's time to do it, all you got to do is do it. Next is willpower. I've shared this study with a number of people. It's in the New York Times. If you want to Google it, it's very interesting. It's a study of Israeli judges making parole decisions. And the profound thing is they found, wow, the percent probability of being granted parole was not found to be a function of your crime or rehabilitation. It was found to be a function of what order your case was presented. In other words, it was like the time of day. If you were one of the first cases, you had about a 65% chance of parole. If you showed up after a few hours, your chance of parole may have gone to 0, unless the judge took a snack break. They take a break, they get something to eat, they go back on the bench, and suddenly the probability of parole jumps back up to 65%, except now it's even more fleeting. By the end of the day, it just crashes. And what this says is even people whose entire job is to be impartial, to be steady, to be consistent, can't do it. Because how we make decisions, how we decide what we're going to do, is a function of our physical self. And we are burning our glucose all the time. The brain is a hot motor. And so if it's chewed up all the glucose, it's made too many decisions, it's worn out, it will not choose to do things that are hard. So again, one thing, set out to do easier things. 2, don't set out to do them for too long. We have about 90 minutes of really pretty decent focus in us. Then we need that little break, prop it back up. So even whether this is how you're doing meetings, this is how you're making your calls, or you're following up with clients, whatever you're doing, break it into shorter sprints. All right, last thing is just habits. So I think almost everybody knows most of the study or the theory around habits is myth. Where do these myths come from? 1960, Dr. Maxwell Maltz, who's a plastic surgeon, and what he observed is when you do an amputation or you do a facial reconstruction, after a few weeks, the brain adjusts. So if I was to give you a new nose, you'd look in the mirror and see, ooh, that's not my nose. But a few weeks later, that nose actually starts to look like mine. If we unfortunately had an amputation, there's pain in that limb that's no longer there. It itches or it hurts, but it's actually not even there. It's activity in the brain. After a few weeks, that starts to subside. And so what Dr. Maxwell Maltz was absolutely right in saying is the brain can rewire, and it takes a few weeks for that to happen. What he never said, but other people picked up on, was, oh, it takes a few weeks to wire the brain. Therefore, if I want to become really good at doing something, I just need to do it for a few weeks, i.e., I can build a habit in 21 days. He never said it. It's not true. And it was many, many years before somebody tried to disprove it. And that person was Pippa Lally. Philippa Lally, I guess is her full name. I reached out to her, which I'm going to tell you why in a minute. And so she goes by Pippa. But this was in University College in London. And she published a study that was widely cited and has been in books and articles over the last 10 to 15 years. And it basically said, look, it's not 21 days, it's 66 days. That's why you haven't been able to stick with things, is you didn't stick with it long enough. Except that's not what she said. That is not what her research was about. It was like a case of Maxwell Maltz all over again. What Pippa Lally set out to do was say, I know things get easier as I repeat them, but I also know They don't get easier indefinitely. At some point, they stop getting easier and they are as easy as they're going to be. That whole concept is called automaticity. I'll talk about it in a second. But what she found is given any particular person with any particular behavior, how long it takes for it to get as easy as it's going to get depends. And it ranges from 18 to 254 days. Now, her study did not even last 100 days. So she was actually extrapolating on the data to get to 254. That's not real, that's extrapolated. And there's something else really important, which I got to get to in a second. But the other thing is a lot of these behaviors never became automatic. What happened is they got easier. They can predictably get easier. But when they get as easy as they're going to get, if they're still hard, they're not habits. And this is sort of what that looked like. Automaticity says a behavior gets easier if I consistently repeat it. And then it stops getting easier. It gets less easy and less easy until finally it's as easy as it's going to get. And the real problem here was some of these behaviors plateaued low. In other words, some things are hard. They're hard even though they got a little easier. They're still hard. And there's no way a hard behavior is suddenly an automatic habit. It's just not a thing. You won't automatically find yourself doing push-ups in the morning. If you don't like doing push-ups, you won't automatically just find yourselves out for a jog, just running fast because it's just become a habit. If you hate running, it may not get that much easier. I hate to tell you that. And the same is true at work. Having hard conversations, making cold calls, and doing the parts of our job that are difficult may stay difficult. So what do you do with these low automaticity behaviors? Number one is you do not take your eye off them. Do not believe that they're just going to suddenly become habits. The key here is when we're working on ourselves, we shouldn't be doing it by ourselves. Ultimately, there are things that allow people to do hard things whether they want to or not. And it's really much more about developing strong rituals. What we found in the work that we did was there were 5 factors present in every place where people did hard things. Number 1 was high clarity. Number 2 was strong leadership. Number 3 was the time and energy necessary to do those things. Number 4 was it was visible to others whether or not they did them, so high accountability. And critical, number 5, is positive reinforcement. So a lot of people think accountability is enough. If I actually just put your name on a leaderboard and I put it on the wall, that will do it. It doesn't. It doesn't do it unless there is high trust in relationship and also there's a lot of recurring positive reinforcement. So we ended up changing our challenge formula, challenging people to take on a couple of habits, do them over time. Sometimes we would change the variable, like do it for 4 weeks, do it for 10 weeks, do it for 12. But then we started adding these other factors, deciding when they were going to do it, making sure it was crystal clear whether they did it or not, and booking it on their calendar was huge. Deciding who they were going to check in with on a weekly basis, and also getting at personal leadership, developing a clear sense of purpose and connecting this behavior to why it matters. Suddenly, the results skyrocketed. We found that we could take groups of people and 90% of them would be doing their behaviors at a 90% probability after 12 weeks. It was transformational. And these things are free. So here's the challenge, and it is to pick a few things, at least 3 capacity behaviors, at least 3 production behaviors that you want to embrace as routines in your life to drive and elevate your performance. I'm going to walk through how the challenge works in the next video, but the key thing will be don't try to do this by yourself. Thanks.